Welcome to Trending in Education. This is Mike Palmer. I'm joined today by Katy Knight, who's the president and executive director of the Siegel Family Endowment. Really interesting organization that's doing work spanning learning, workforce, infrastructure. Katy, welcome to Trending in Education.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Truth be told, I did produce an episode of The Cusp that you were on with Paul Thane. I've been part of the Katy Knight experience, but I don't think our listeners have. So can we start by hearing your origin story, how you got to this point in your professional life?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you've already heard all my jokes if you edited me with Paul, so I'll try to think of some new ones on the fly. But I'm just a regular schmegular girl from New York. I grew up in New York in Brooklyn and Queens, going to public school and then on scholarship to private school and then to fancy Ivy League college at UPenn. So I
Mhm.
think I've had just the gamut of educational experiences that I could have had in my life, which, we're all education experts because we've been through it, except not really. I feel really fortunate to have gone from that experience in undergrad to working in nonprofit in sort of real estate marketing that had a community engagement lens, and then over to Google, where I worked for about 4 years on public policy, community engagement, some of our education programs. And I feel like that for me was the trial by fire of learning about the tech industry.
Yeah.
I started at Google in 2012, so it was the heyday.
Yeah,
Dark and
the year of the
evil.
MOOC.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the MOOCs. And we were excited we were going to give everyone the internet in hot air balloons and
Right.
self-driving cars and Google Glass.
Mhm.
And I actually joined Google originally to work on Google Plus. And most people don't remember Google Plus because it did not last very long. So I've had experience with tech success and failure.
Mm.
And and from there I just wound up kind of going to work on community engagement at our chairman's company, Two Sigma, which is a New York quant firm, financial sciences company. But I wound up just really intrigued by and having these interesting conversations with David Siegel, our chairman, about tech and society stuff. And over the course of a year, through multiple different reasons, I wound up joining the team to help build out his philanthropy in a full-time way. And
Mhm.
after a few years, in the middle of 2019, I took over as executive director and president. I had just enough time from June 2019 to March of 2020
Yeah.
to plan how we were going to change everything and
Uh-huh.
streamline and strategy and all these things. And then it was a pandemic and we all went home. Uh,
Yeah.
and since then, I think, the tech and society issue, that the sort of core of what Siegel's identity is, and I think what has accidentally become my life's work somehow, is now this incredibly important, potent, powerful conversation that people want to have. Where, when I first started doing this work, I think leaving Google, people thought, wow, that's crazy. My family did not believe, like, what is tech and society issues? Like, why does anyone care about that?
Yeah.
Who's letting you work on this? So definitely a different world we're living in now.
Yeah, and then maybe a little bit more on the Siegel Family Endowment itself. You kind of touched on it there, but can you catch our listeners up on what that's all about?
Yeah, so Siegel Family Endowment has been around for just about a decade or so, give or take, depending on how you count. So pretty young in philanthropy years. Our chairman is David Siegel, who's one of the co-founders of Two Sigma Investments, and he's a computer scientist, roboticist. He did his PhD at MIT in computer science, artificial intelligence lab.
Mm.
So an early thinker on these things. It was the 80s. And we have been working for the last decade or so on just issues of tech and society. And so for David, it started with, I had access to these opportunities, other people don't. People need to understand that technology is important, that it's a great educational tool, that there's just so much opportunity economically and for your life and for creativity if you can harness technology. So really started from this basis of just trying to get more young people access to the opportunity to engage with technology deeply. We were early supporters of the Scratch Foundation and scaling Scratch, the block-based programming language for kids.
Mhm.
And that, I think, still is very core to our ethos. Like, it's not just everyone needs to learn to code, right? It's about technology writ large playing an incredibly impactful role in our lives
Yeah.
and what we're going to do about that, with that, for that. Like that is really how we've grown from being focused on just, okay, access to tech, education, opportunity for creative learning to now encompass learning, both, traditional K-12 systems and out of school time, workforce, training, funding, economic development, and then the most recently added piece of infrastructure. So how do all these things fit together? What undergirds them? And what does society actually need as the infrastructure to thrive in the innovation era, in the tech era?
Yeah, it was interesting as I was preparing for the interview, I was looking at your website, and the grantees really do run the gamut from very small things to very big things, smaller institutions, and then also a lot of the heavy hitters and a lot of like R1 top tier, like the MITs and the Stanfords and all that. It's a pretty impressive portfolio. And then the fact that you have the infrastructure piece there is interesting. I wind up talking to a lot of people who are discussing either learning or learning in the workforce or how the two relate. I'm a big fan of three-legged stools. So this third piece in the stool of infrastructure, it's kind of a fuzzy word, but it's really important, I think, to think about. We'll get into AI and some of its implications on all this in a bit. Can you flesh out a little bit more what you mean by infrastructure and how that came into being?
Yeah, of course. So for us, infrastructure, it was first about redefining that terminology. So when you think of infrastructure, you're like bridges, the subway, trains, roads, of course. Gray infrastructure, physical infrastructure, hard infrastructure, all of that still matters. But as we were looking around at the world and, we'd been doing some work in just sort of supporting the internet broadly. So open source organizations, contributing to the Wikipedia Foundation, contributing to the maintainers that help with some of the open source code that so many things on the internet rely on, right? So we've been doing this sort of internet infrastructure work.
Mm.
We started to think, okay, well, we need to elevate this digital infrastructure so that people understand that it's as important and not just the fiber cables and the broadband, but like the actual digital infrastructure, the building blocks that even get us to be able to have AI, search engines, algorithmic decision making, all of those things.
Yeah.
Let's talk about digital infrastructure. And over the course of about a year of workshopping this concept of infrastructure, we realized there was also a third missing piece in that stool, which was the social infrastructure component.
Yeah.
And so the thesis there is like all infrastructure has physical, digital, and social implications and components.
Yeah.
And we have to think about all of those things if we're going to actually create the right baseline
Mhm.
for everyone to have access to opportunity, for everyone to have access to the innovation economy, for everyone to have just a chance to thrive in the incredible sort of wealth generating, wide, expansive world that we're creating with technology.
Yeah, and, I could see how that would be particularly relevant coming out of COVID, where, the way we think about even, the fact that you and I are recording this in Zoom right now, this stuff is just part of the digital infrastructure of how folks operate. That all transformed. I was checking out your schools as infrastructure report, which, did connect a lot of the dots for me around the role that schools play in their communities. It's something we talk about a lot, but you guys just did some more in-depth research on the topic.
It's funny. The infrastructure concept definitely, the pandemic accelerated people's understanding of what infrastructure was. So
Mm.
we'd built a communications plan that was just like, we have to explain to people why digital communication technology is important and not, out the window, right? Everyone gets it now. But coming back to sort of the physical piece of schools and why do they matter? Why does it matter that we're going places in person? What's the purpose and intention of this building, this space?
Yeah.
We think about the places that people recognize as anchors in their community as powerful institutions that we should be really thinking about their place beyond the obvious.
Mhm.
And I think especially informed by some work that we've done with schools. We were doing some work in and around Atlanta and the school's not at capacity, right? The building is not full all day,
Yeah.
much less in the evenings or early mornings. And so I think that sort of real life experience also helped us think about, hey, why are we not looking at these assets and saying, how can the community benefit from them? And also the school then benefit from the community, right? We create just a closer relationship and community matters. And so we think there's positivity in the outcomes that you get there.
it also struck me, I did see there was some mention of like rural education as well. And it is a place where pretty much everywhere in America, the school is still that sort of standard bearer, that place where, beyond their home, how do folks identify with our culture? And, maybe it's through a church or another, community organization, but pretty much across the board, it's also through schools. And schools are very complicated space, obviously, and we're talking about technology and society. That brings us to the 600-pound AI gorilla in the room, which is artificial intelligence. It's something that everybody's talking about. Just about every show that I do, we touch on it. I will mention, we are saying that we're pretty squarely in the trough of disillusionment. We've passed the peak of inflated expectations, especially in education, I think. And folks are,
Okay.
are kind of betting don't pass right now, perhaps overly so. I think folks might be almost overly indexed on failure narratives. The Ed story, with the LAUSD certainly didn't help things.
Yeah.
That's still kind of unfolding. But I was really struck by how broad your purview is and how that might help you see things that we don't see. What are you noticing where it comes to, AI and how it intersects with the world of learning?
Yeah, so I will say I probably started in the trough of disillusionment, and so I've been debating sort of whether it's worth it to climb out or should I just stay down here and like set up a chair. I'm like,
Sure.
and I have to say, I have to preface this by saying my husband was a classroom teacher in the middle school for 8 years in New York City DOE. So my opinions are all very
Mm.
informed by a real life curmudgeon who works now in sort of ed tech adjacent spaces.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
we have been down in disillusionment land together. But I think there's some excitement now for me. I think there did need to be a bit of a level setting around what is this and what can it do?
Mhm.
And it's one of the things that I think is frustrating with technology in general, right? AI, like many other new shiny tech things that have emerged in the last couple of decades, gets introduced as a cure all, gets introduced as, hey, we've got a new solution for you. And I'm looking up and I'm saying, but to what problem?
Right.
Like, having been in the tech industry, I understand the well-intentioned folks building things that they believe will be of service, but there's just not enough conversation and connection to what actually is of service. And
Yeah.
that's a frustration. But I think in AI in particular, some of the exciting things are the back end kind of what this might do for teacher prep is something people are excited about and talking about. I'd love to see more actual research on that front. But I think, attendance, scheduling, sort of the boring things that we haven't spent a lot of time and money innovating on in the last bit, I think could actually be vastly improved by sort of algorithms and generative AI playing a role there.
Mhm.
And then I think, the student facing tools, the LAUSD situation, the desire to have a one stop shop, like, well, let's take a step back and think about why now do we think that it's possible to create a one stop shop when we didn't have it? We couldn't put it on a website before, we
Yeah.
couldn't put it in a portal. And now we think we're going to feed it all to AI. So starting just from a level of, do we even have the systems in place? Do we have what it takes to use this? Do our students have enough access at home that this is going to be useful for them? Like, I think those kind of questions are the ones that I'd like to see elevated in the AI conversation.
Mhm.
Are we getting too far ahead of ourselves if we're talking about, every student has a Gen AI tutor companion
Right.
when we don't know that every student has internet at home or
Right.
a device that's capable of doing that,
Yeah.
or if that's really going to help them. So I think there's a lot of potential personalization, potential for sort of interesting baseline opportunities, but I don't get as jazzed as I think we all initially were about the
Right.
the power here.
It does feel like I've called it Clippy's revenge. It feels like we're just there were so many
Yeah.
mascots at the AI
Yes.
show out in San Diego. They're all in their suits walking around. And it's
Yeah.
like, sure, you can build a chatbot, but to your point, like in service of what? Like, what are you
Yeah.
actually trying to build out? That does bring me back to the infrastructure side. It does seem like the underlying data tends to be kind of a mess, and it's a
Yeah.
lot of systems, a lot of ed tech solutions kind of stapled together, and maybe somebody knows where all the data sits, but maybe not. And that's why, I do think there is a genuine cautionary tale about ed out there where, if the integrations don't exist, if your data is not clean under the hood, AI is not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix it all for you. But interestingly, and maybe I'm a bit of a AI nerd now too, but like data interoperability and some of the standards and some of the stuff around like data privacy and cybersecurity, that to me is also where I would imagine an organization like yours could actually try to address some of those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you brought up Clippy because I've been saying that to everyone who will listen, and I thought I was the only one who was like,
Uh,
poor Clippy.
yeah.
Poor Clippy's been ignored, and all we're doing is reinventing Clippy. Just bring
Mm,
him back.
right.
But yeah, I think absolutely interoperability is the word that no one knew, despite,
Yeah.
best efforts of our friends at Innovate EDU and
Yeah.
Project
It's like
Unicorn to,
it's like the new infrastructure.
yeah, yeah. Data, I mean, there have been lots of headlines about data in the past decade. Data is the new oil,
Yes.
data is everything. And huge, huge conversation to be had about data privacy, stewardship,
Mhm.
monetization, all of these things that have become really central to our culture and economy.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, if the AI conversation can make people aware of like what kind of data we have on students, what kind of data we don't have and need. I mean, going back to what I was saying about we don't know if the kid has internet at home, we actually could know that, and we could solve that if
Yeah.
we had connected systems that we learned in New York City in the DOE. We learned a lot about which kids had internet at home and did everything we could to get them internet and devices. And now we're sitting on that information and there's no long-term sort of solution making that's happening. And I
Mhm.
think if it were easier to connect systems across not just school, in school, out of school time stuff, but also across social work systems,
Yeah.
I think we could do a lot to modernize people's lives because we'd be able to just create easier opportunities for them to say, hey, this is the need I have. Yep, we can validate that right here. And, or your child comes to school and tells the teacher, hey, I actually don't have internet at home to do this homework, to turn it in on Google Classroom. Okay, great. Like, we can validate that. We know how to reach your parent. We know how to get you hooked up with this program. Like, we're just not doing some really basic things that could be huge enhancements. And I think that's one of my many frustrations with the tech industry is like, what are our best and brightest minds working on? And
Mhm.
how do we sort of shift them toward solving real problems? We have this body of work around public interest technology with some other foundations. It's really focused on thinking about like, how do we build tech that's in the public interest?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. The skills conversation's been coming up a lot with AI and what are the things that humans are going to have to continue to be good at. And what you were just talking about, problem formulation is probably right at the top of the list where, in a lot of ways we should be supercharged by this new technology, but, in service of what? What are we pointed at? Do we actually solve the underlying infrastructure problems and spend a little time on that? The other concept, I worked in software development at Kaplan for a while, and, technical debt was something we were very transparent about. And it's a trade off that you think about when you make a decision. And sometimes something goes out there that's not 100% clean. Look at CrowdStrike last
Mhm.
week, reminded us of, technology can be fragile at times. It can actually break. And it's hard to get folks to shift to investing in making the system resilient, making the system, equitable to your point. We talked about learning, we talked about infrastructure. The other pillar out there is workforce.
Mhm.
And that's another area that comes up quite a bit when folks are talking about trends in education and what's happening now. Future of work is the buzzword, that folks like to drop, but stuff is changing. Even if you look at the pandemic, that was a major cultural shift in the way that we work, how we think about time in the office versus time at home. Same is true for time at school. But
Mhm.
then coming out of that, right as we were starting to rebound from the pandemic, AI came in, and even before folks could fully rebound back to the way it was in 2019, suddenly there was this disruptive technology that every CFO is asking about. How does workforce kind of factor into the mix?
So I think there's a ton of stuff that's been happening in workforce beyond AI, or like there's a lot of economic trends, globalization, automation, all of these things I think that we were talking about before AI and trying to figure out, well, what has the impact of globalization versus automation been? Like really trying to dig into some of the details of what these things had done. And now it's a sudden pivot to, okay, and so now what will AI do? And it's tough to predict, right? And one of the things that I come back to is even if we have the best laid plans for how this might be useful, not useful, disruptive, humans are also irrational. And so when I think about how we're going to apply AI in our jobs or use AI in our jobs, I think, what we're seeing right now is there's a lot of bottom up people fooling with ChatGPT and other sort of chatbots to create email drafts or whatever the case may be. And then a little bit of top down. There's some leaders saying, yes, play with these tools, or yes, experiment with this sandbox we've created.
Here.
But there's not a lot of there yet, in my opinion.
Hmm.
So a little bit of productivity studies we've done, a little bit of insight into how this might help, white collar workers in one way or another. I imagine that when we sort of circle back to AI plus augmented reality, for example, then we might see some interesting innovations in training or in the work experience. Maybe
Hmm.
you'll work from home, but you'll be in an office like setting. Like who
Yeah.
can say long term?
Mm.
But I think in the short term, what we're seeing with AI and one of our new focus areas for the coming year will be trying to understand through research how will AI impact workers? What is happening right now? And what does it look like? How are employers making those decisions? How might it change employment in general?
Mm.
And thinking about sort of across different sectors, what that will look like, because it'll look different in different places, different types of businesses, different regions. So, all that just to say, I don't quite know, but we can continue to focus on, I think, the pillars for us there are a bit of training. Everyone's invested in training folks who either have not had, post-secondary experience or who are looking to change careers or for whom traditional education hasn't worked. So we're invested in some great training programs, but more importantly, thinking about scale and economic development and how we think about where people are going with all this training. I
Hmm.
think we over indexed on training for a little while there when the tech boom was at its height and everyone
Right.
was really thinking about, okay, how do we get everyone a job as an engineer? Like that's the ticket.
Mm.
And now I think we have a really robust market of training programs, not a great sense of how to stack rank them, how to fund them longer term,
Mhm.
and I think how to scaffold people through careers in these new industries and new sectors. And how do we keep them going and not just get them into a first job? So
Mm.
some of our concerns are really like, what's the second order impacts here? What's the next step for people? And thinking about how it generationally can impact their families, their kids, like that sort of thing. Again, comes back to infrastructure. Like it's all connected
Right.
and that's how we wind up like a centrist area.
Yeah. And I imagine this also, I remember this first during the pandemic with digital readiness and the fact that different segments out there of the population just weren't ready to deal with all their banking on their phone, for example. So in the early days of COVID, how did those people operate? How do they function? And, I think there's been a bit of a leveling up culturally through the pandemic globally, really.
Mhm.
But how we deal with technology is still, there's a lot of authentic and perhaps well founded distrust of technology, on the heels of social media and all the blowback we've seen there. And now AI is coming onto the dance floor, and some of us maybe
Yeah.
see some upside and some opportunity, but frequently that's because you're coming at it from a place of privilege to begin with. So it's almost like, reaching folks who might have that distrust to kind of let them know here's how there is some economic upside for you and your family to lean into the tech. Cause, if I'm hearing you right too, like you're not saying stay away. It's
Right.
more, we haven't really found enough, home run, runaway hits with its use so far. But part of
Mhm.
that is because, as you mentioned, humans are irrational and they may be a little distrustful of the technology.
Yeah, there's no obvious, selling point for me, for someone who's distrustful of technology to say, and here's why AI is great. In fact, I can think of 10 reasons why it's not, and I would just sort of further enhance their distrust.
Here.
But if we give people the opportunity to dig in and understand, if we make the tech more transparent, if we equip them with just a deeper understanding and digital literacy with these things, that changes the picture a bit.
Mm.
And it hopefully makes it possible for people to make more informed choices as consumers. We have this incredible sort of big tech everywhere society and people, everyone's got a Gmail. I've got a Gmail. And when Gmail first launched, that was a huge deal. Now it's the default. And so you have to stop and think about, what are the trade-offs there? What are we doing if we're all using the big tech default? And
Mhm.
how do we get people to a place where there's more competition in the tech sector because people are looking at different products because they're informed consumers who understand like their data privacy or their digital rights or what they
Right.
want. And I think that's the pipe dream, but I think it is possible. I think, like you said, the pandemic accelerated people's understanding. And my hope is that we can continue to do that. That
Yeah.
instead of being scared of, the headlines about AI, we're like, okay, nope, we're in charge here. Let's see what this is all about and dig into it and figure out how we're going to use it.
Yeah. Although for me, there's also almost like AI marketing fatigue. Like I get so tired of everybody talking about how they're using AI when, you know, they were using AI before too. Like it's now generative AI is
Yeah.
out there. So everybody's got a chatbot. Everybody's trying to kind of sell you on it. And I think that almost feeds into the distrust as opposed to really kind of building that belief. All right, we've done a good job talking about AI, but I know you guys also span technology. You mentioned augmented reality. I'd love to hear anything else out there that you think might be a game changer. In some ways, AI has kind of taken up all the oxygen in the room, but there's other technologies out there that are also emerging. Anything you wanted to share?
Yeah, so I think, generative AI is in the headlines. Algorithms, algorithmic decision making, all of those things still matter a lot. So I've just been reminding people we can't forget about like there's some very well developed machine learning that is
Right.
very active in our lives. So we can't forget about that, both the
Hmm.
power, the risk, the potential there.
After the trough of disillusionment, there's the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity. So, there's life on the other side.
Yeah, love that. But I think, in terms of education, I think there's a lot. I mentioned augmented reality because I think the relationship between the physical and digital worlds is really fascinating to me.
Hmm.
And what we can do with sensors and motion and graphics and just the combination, right, of these various technologies that comes together in something forward facing like that is really interesting. And I don't know. I think there's something there. When I think about what the next era of the internet might be, we had the social web bring us all online so that we almost forgot about the physical world, right? We all exist in these online communities now. I don't need to talk to my neighbors because I have a Facebook group for my neighborhood. I
Right.
don't need to go find someone to engage in this hobby with because there's a subreddit for it.
Right.
And that's great in some ways, but I think that lack of relationship with physical communities is also detrimental.
Mhm.
And I think if I had time to dig into this, I'd probably be doing more research, sociological research on that relationship.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about technologies that bring us back in some ways to the physical and kind of rebalance that relationship between the
Mm-hmm.
digital and physical worlds so that we're not all just stuck on our computers, kind of living adjacent to each other rather than together.
Yeah. I've heard more folks talking about that too. Like, can even AI start to enhance and power more human connection? In the example of tutoring, rather than an AI tutor, can the AI get better at matching or empowering the tutors? But I like the idea of technology that actually is pulling us back together as opposed to pushing us apart. Really interesting stuff here. I'm talking with Katy Knight, who is the president and executive director of the Siegel Family Endowment. Katie, it's been a wonderful conversation. Any other thoughts out there? One thing we haven't gotten into is like lessons learned. You're someone who's really had an interesting trajectory in your career. You've gotten to a really amazing vantage point over a successful climb. But any advice or any suggestions to folks out there who might be listening who are interested in making an impact and they're thinking about, the world of education, the world of workforce and infrastructure?
Yeah. So one thing, because my initial inclination before getting into this space was that I was going to start a nonprofit. Don't start a nonprofit. There's so many already,
Yeah.
and we're all doing great work. I think, the more that we can de-silo. So if you care about education, don't just approach it as, okay, in my day job, I work in finance and now I want to figure out how to make an impact in education. Think about where there's a through line so that you're connecting your world to education
Yeah.
or the workforce world to education. I think that's the thing where people who are not already inside of these organizations or already in the field have so much to add with that perspective of, okay, for everyone who's just already been in the same circle talking about this educational problem,
Mm,
how can new insight, new energy, and new connection points make this conversation better, enhance it, like actually be impactful? Because that's where I've seen some of the most interesting things happen is just when people get out of the box that we put ourselves in and they're like, okay, I'm going to go talk to someone who actually does not work in my field and figure out what the relationship between what I do and what they do is so that we can do something better together.
mhm. Yeah, and I have been struck by how much movement there has been, since 2020, where that was, the Great Resignation and the Great Awakening and the Great whatevers, but also, the nature of work's changing, layoffs are more frequent, but the economy is still strong, at least right now. Those are all interesting kind of macro factors that perhaps free folks up to take those chances and to, perhaps come out of this awakening phase with a little more alignment to
Yeah.
some sense of purpose, some sense of mission. Any concluding thoughts, any takeaways for our listeners as we wrap up here?
I think the big thing, I feel like I've said it over and over again, but like, let's be in charge of this technology. I don't want technology in charge of us in any way, shape, or form.
Mm,
So let's be informed consumers. Let's be, diligent creators. Let's be in charge of this technology.
mm. Yeah, I love it because, I think if you don't come at it with enough ego strength, I've also heard it as executive function. If you're not treating your AI as though you're the boss, there'll be dragons. There are some danger zones you might stumble into over there.
Exactly.
Katy Knight, amazing having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you. It's great to be here.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please write us a review, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.